Gather round, children of the dust and the delta, ye who still hear the echo of chains clanking in your blood. Come close to this fire of remembering, for I am an old one, bent by the weight of centuries carried in these bones. My voice carries the salt of the Middle Passage, the whip's cruel kiss on bare backs, the auction block where mamas watched babies torn from their arms and sold like cotton bales. I speak slow, for each word bears the bruise of history, and tonight I tell you of a daughter born in bondage, a woman whose very flesh became scripture written in scars. O corpo de Lucy Parsons viru a mappa de horrores. Listen here, folk. This story ain't in the white man's books. It lives in the wind that still blows through the factory smoke, in the blood the cobblestones of Chicago drank and never forgot. Her name was Lucia, called Lucy, and her body carried the map that points to revolution. Now listen here, child, for this is how it all started. In them days of deep sorrow, somewhere between the red clay of Virginia and the dust-choked plains of Texas, nobody knows for certain, Lord have mercy, a girl child was born into bondage around 1851, maybe 1853. The old ones say time didn't matter much when you was property, when your birth date was just another line in the master's ledger book, written in the same hand that counted cotton bales and livestock. Her mama, Charlotte, was enslaved, suffering creature with hands worn to leather from field work, and the father, gone with the wind, lost to the auction block or buried in forgetting, or maybe just a white man who took what he wanted and walked away clean. They called her Lucia, though some say she carried Mexican blood, Creek blood too, running through her veins like rivers meeting in secret. But the law, cruel earth that it was, saw only the one-drop shadow, the African mark that made her chattel, made her less than the mule in the barn, less than the hoe in the field. Sweet Jesus. The child came into this world already branded by invisible chains, already marked for suffering. The quiet of the quarters at night when the moon hung low and heavy like a watching eye, old folks whispered about the girl with 3 bloodlines. That child gonna walk a hard road, they said, shaking their heads. Mixed blood child in a world that don't want nothing mixed but misery. The quarters, them dark cabins with mud-chinked walls, carried heavy spirits, and young Lucia learned early to move quiet, to make herself small, to understand that survival meant swallowing your own voice until it became a stone in your belly. The first scar she carried wasn't on her skin, no sir. It was deeper. It was the memory of separation, that soul wound that every enslaved child knew. Whether it was her mama being sold away or threatened with it, or watching other children torn from their mother's arms at the auction block, the trauma planted itself in her bones. Folks swear on their lives they seen children no bigger than fence posts, standing on those wooden platforms in Charleston, in Richmond, in New Orleans, while white men in fine hats bid on them like they was furniture. The auctioneer's voice, cold and mechanical, calling out, "Prime young girl, good teeth, strong back, breed well in time." Lord of glory. The shame of it burns even now in the telling. Young Lucia grew up during the war years, when the South was tearing itself apart over the very bodies of folk like her. The plantation where she lived, somewhere in the vastness of Texas, that lawless land where slavery held on with bloody fingers, ran on cotton and cruelty. The overseer showed no mercy for weakness, man nobody dared look at, with a whip that sang through the air like a demon's prayer. The sound of it, that crack, became the rhythm of daily life, regular as a heartbeat, terrible as death. She was just a child, but already her body knew the weight of bondage, the heavy sun that beat down on the cotton fields like punishment from above, the taste of cornmeal mush that never quite filled the belly, the rough homespun dress that scratched skin raw, the bare feet on burning earth in summer, on frozen ground in winter, the endless labor. Even children worked, picking cotton until their small fingers bled, carrying water to the field hands, tending the master's children while their own mamas worked themselves near to death. And the fear, Lord, the fear. It hung over the quarters like smoke that never cleared. Fear of the paddy rollers' dogs baying in the night. Fear of being sold down the river to the deeper south where they worked you to bones and dust. Fear of the branding iron, the whipping post, the splitting wood used to punish runaways, fear of white men's hands that took liberties in the dark, fear that became a companion, a second skin, a sixth sense that kept you alive. But here's what the old wise ones taught her in secret, when the masters wasn't watching. Resistance, not the kind with guns and fire, though that came too in places, but the everyday kind. The kind where you moved slow when massa wanted you fast, where you broke a tool by accident, where you sang spirituals with double meanings. Steal away, steal away, steal away to Jesus. The words sounding like praise but meaning run, brother, run. Where you kept alive the memory of Africa, in the way you braided hair, in the herbs you used to heal, in the stories told in Gula and Geechee tongue that the white folks couldn't understand. In them days, even hope had to hide. The war came and went like a fever dream. Word filtered down to the quarters in whispers. Lincoln, emancipation, freedom. But freedom for enslaved folk in Texas came late, came slow, came on June 19, 1865. Juneteenth, they called it, when Union soldiers finally rode in to tell them the chains was broken. Lucia was maybe 12, 13, 14 years old. Old enough to remember bondage, young enough to believe freedom might mean something real. Poor soul. She didn't know yet that freedom and justice was two different things entirely. Emancipation brought new chains, ones you couldn't see but felt just as heavy. The plantation owners didn't just let folk go. They trapped them with sharecropping, with debt that multiplied like demons, with contracts written in language the newly freed couldn't read. You work my land, the white men said, and I'll give you a share of the crop. But somehow the share never quite covered what you owed for seed, for tools, for the shack you lived in, for the food you bought on credit at the masses store. Bondage shows no mercy for weakness, whether you wearing iron chains or paper ones. And the violence, great God in heaven. The Ku Klux Terror rode through the South like the Four Horsemen, burning crosses, lynching black men for looking at white women wrong, for trying to vote, for daring to own land, for nothing at all except being black and breathing. Night riders with hoods and ropes setting fires, dragging men from their beds while their wives and children screamed. The earth drank more blood in those years than during slavery itself, some say. Young Lucia, now going by Lucy, saw it all. In Texas, where she came of age, the freed people tried to build lives from nothing. They established schools, churches, businesses. But white supremacy pushed back with organized violence, with laws designed to re-enslave in everything but name, with economic terrorism that kept black folk locked in poverty. The promise of 40 acres and a mule turned to dust in folks' hands. This was the world that shaped her, not just the memory of slavery, but the reality of a freedom that wasn't free. A world where the law said you was equal but the rope said different, where you could vote in theory, but the polling station had armed white men at the door, where you could own land in principle but the bank wouldn't give you credit, and your white neighbors would burn your crops and kill your livestock until you gave up and sold for pennies. Lucy learned early that the fight wasn't over. That emancipation was just a word on paper until you made it real with blood and struggle, and refusing to bow. She learned that resistance took many forms: education, organizing, speaking truth, building community, protecting your own. She learned that survival itself was an act of defiance. But the day of supposed freedom brought its own revelations, and they was bitter as gall. Them promises was smoke and mirrors. The chains had just changed form, transmuted from iron to cotton contracts, from whips to wage slavery, from auction blocks to company stores that owned your debt and therefore owned you. And so Lucy Parsons, marked by slavery, shaped by broken promises, carrying the weight of her people's suffering in her very bones, prepared to meet her destiny. She didn't know it yet, but she was about to fall in love with a white man who would turn his back on his own race and fight for justice. Together they would flee Texas ahead of lynch mobs. Together they would go to Chicago, that raw northern city of smoke and steel. Together they would discover that wage slavery was just another name for the bondage they'd thought they'd left behind. But the day the North called her name, the day she decided to cross that line, brought with it a warning that still echoes. Freedom ain't given, child. It's taken, and the price is written in scars on the body, in fire in the soul, in the willingness to fight until your last breath leaves you. And that's how it all started. Now you see, people, the body of Lucy Parsons was already becoming a map, though the worst marks was yet to come. Don't be fooled, children. Love across the color line in them days wasn't some sweet romance like the white folks write in their storybooks. It was dangerous. It was illegal. It was a death sentence waiting to happen. But hearts don't always listen to laws, and souls don't always respect the barriers that evil men build between people. Around 1870, maybe 1873, time gets fuzzy when you're talking about lives lived in the shadows. Young Lucy met a man named Albert Parsons. Now hold on, because this part gonna surprise you. Albert was white. Not just white, but a former Confederate soldier. A man who'd worn the gray uniform and fought for the very system that had enslaved Lucy's mama and tried to enslave her future. But here's where the story gets complicated, the way real life always is. Albert Parsons wasn't no ordinary white man. Lord have mercy. Something had changed in him during Reconstruction. Maybe it was seeing the brutality up close. Maybe it was reading, learning, thinking. Maybe it was meeting black folk as human beings instead of property and realizing everything he'd been taught was a damned lie. Whatever it was, Albert turned his coat, politically speaking, and became a radical Republican, fighting for black voting rights, for dignity, for justice. The old folks say the first time Lucy saw Albert, he was speaking at a political rally in Texas, his voice strong and clear, saying things white men just didn't say in those parts. Talking about equality, about the rights of the freed people, about how the plantation owners was just trying to re-enslave everybody under a new name. She was maybe 18, 19 years old, with eyes that had already seen too much suffering, but still held fire. And he saw her in that crowd, saw not property, not a shadow, but a woman of steel, a fierce soul with a mind sharp as any blade. Folks swear on their lives they seen how those two looked at each other, and they knew trouble was coming. In them days, a white man courting a black woman, or Mexican or mixed blood, whatever Lucy was, wasn't just frowned upon. It was illegal in most southern states under anti-miscegenation laws. It was a violation that could get you killed by night riders, hanged from a tree, burned alive. The Ku Klux Klan didn't need much excuse, but a race traitor who loved a dark-skinned woman? That was all the excuse they needed. But Albert was stubborn old one in his own way, and Lucy was no scared girl willing to hide her light. They courted in secret at first, meeting in out-of-the-way places, away from prying eyes. Albert taught her to read better, shared newspapers and books with her. Lucy taught him about the real lives of black folk in Texas, about the terror and the resistance, about survival strategies the privileged never had to learn. They talked politics, philosophy, the possibility of a different world. And somewhere in all that talk they fell deep, smitten both of them. Love full of pain it would be, love that would cost them everything, but love nonetheless. In the quiet of the quarters at night, when Lucy told her kin what was happening, they worried sick. "Child," the elder said, "that man gonna get you killed. White folks don't forgive what you planning. You think love's stronger than a lynch rope?" And Lucy knew they was right to worry. Every day brought news of some new horror. A black man beaten near death for talking to a white woman. A mixed couple run out of town with nothing but the clothes on their backs. Crosses burning in yards as warnings. But she couldn't stop her heart any more than she could stop the sun from rising. And Albert, Lord of Glory, he was willing to risk everything too. In 1871 or 72, in secret where such unions were forbidden by law and rope, they married. No church ceremony, no public celebration. Just vows spoken in private before God and whoever would bear witness, knowing full well what it might cost. The night riders came not long after. "Don't tell me that," someone might say, "but I'm telling you true. The Klan found out. Word got around the way it always did in small communities where everybody knew everybody's business and grudges ran deeper than rivers. One night, men in hoods rode up to where Albert and Lucy was staying. their torches cutting through the darkness like demons' eyes, their voices raised in hateful shouts. "Come out, race traitor! Bring that Noctur woman out here! We got rope for both of you." Albert grabbed his gun. He'd been expecting this, prepared for it, and Lucy gathered what little they owned. In the chaos and the shouting, they managed to escape into the night, leaving Texas behind with just their lives and each other. Took off running like freedom seekers of old, heading north to where they hoped the color line wasn't drawn quite so deadly. But the fear, oh, the fear. Lucy's body carried it like a brand. Every sound in the dark could be hoofbeats. Every white face could be an enemy. Every town they passed through could be the one where somebody recognized them and decided to finish what the Texas clan had started. She learned to sleep light, to wake at the slightest noise, to always know where the exits were. That constant terror, that perpetual state of alert, it aged her in ways that had nothing to do with years. The emotional scars ran deep as any whip mark. Lucy had survived slavery and its aftermath, but loving Albert across the color line brought a new kind of vulnerability. She'd made herself a target, painted a bullseye on her own back. And for what? For love. For the stubborn belief that two people who cared for each other shouldn't be kept apart by laws written by men too full of hate to see straight. They made their way north through a South still seething with racial violence, still littered with the bodies of black folks who dared to vote, to own land, to look white people in the eye. Through towns where the courthouse square still had the metal ring in the ground where they'd chained slaves for public whipping. Through counties where not a single black person had successfully registered to vote because the registrars kept changing the rules, kept making up new reasons to deny them. And everywhere they went, they saw it, the new chains. Black folk working dawn to dusk in the fields, just like under slavery, except now they got paid in scrip that could only be spent at the company store where prices was inflated. Children in rags, bellies swollen from hunger, no schools for them to attend. Men and women old before their time, backs bent, spirits nearly broken but not quite, never quite, because the human soul is more resilient than any oppressor can imagine. Lucy watched and learned. She saw that bondage wasn't just about legal ownership. It was about economics, about power, about a system designed to keep certain people on the bottom no matter what the law said. And she began to understand that the fight for freedom was bigger than just the fight against slavery. It was a fight against all forms of oppression, all systems that ground human beings into dust for profit. By the time they reached Chicago in 1873, they was both changed people. Albert had fully embraced his role as a fighter for justice, burning the bridges back to his Confederate past. Lucy had transformed from a survivor of slavery into a woman with a vision, someone who could see the connections between different forms of oppression and who wouldn't settle for half measures or false promises. But Chicago, great God in heaven, Chicago was waiting for them with horrors of its own. The city had risen from the ashes of the 1872 fire, rebuilt with the sweat of immigrant workers and the blood of the poor. It was a metropolis of contrasts, gleaming mansions on Michigan Avenue and filthy tenements in the working-class districts, opera houses and slaughterhouses, churches and brothels, immense wealth built on immense suffering. Lucy didn't know it yet, but Chicago would be where her body truly became a map of horrors, where the machinery of industrial capitalism would inscribe its own brutal text on her flesh, adding to the scars slavery had already written, where she would lose fingers to the looms and skin to the acids and peace of mind, to the constant struggle just to survive another day. They settled in, found work, tried to build a life. Albert got a job in publishing, then lost it when his politics got too radical. Lucy worked in sweatshops, them dark, cramped spaces where immigrant women and black women sewed dresses for rich ladies, 14 hours a day, 6 days a week, for wages that barely covered rent and food. The machines was hungry things, always hungry, eating fabric and thread and sometimes fingers when a worker got too tired to pay attention. And Lucy understood. They had crossed the line from Texas to Chicago, from the overt slavery of the South to the wage slavery of the North. But Chicago already had its jaws open wide, ready to devour them whole. The machines that combed cotton in the mills was just as cruel as any overseer. The bosses who squeezed profit from workers' blood was just as ruthless as any plantation massa. And the bodies that piled up in industrial accidents, crushed, burned, poisoned, worked to early graves, was as numerous as the bodies that had fallen under the lash. Now you see, people, the map was about to get new marks, new scars, new chapters written in industrial pain. But the woman who would bear them was no victim. She was becoming a warrior, a voice that would shake the very foundations of power. And that's how Lucy Parsons went from escaped slave to revolutionary fighter, from the cotton fields of Texas to the killing floors of Chicago. Listen here, folk. Chicago, in them years after the Great Fire, was a beast that never slept, never rested, never showed mercy. The city rose from its own ashes hungry for labor, hungry for profit, hungry for the bodies of the poor to feed its furnaces and factories and slaughterhouses. And Lucy Parsons, that fierce soul who'd escaped the plantation, only to find new chains waiting, walked straight into that beast's mouth with her eyes wide open. She found work in the garment district, in one of them sweatshops crammed into dark buildings where the sun never quite reached. Rows and rows of women, Irish, German, Polish, Italian, black, all bent over sewing machines that clattered like demons possessed, stitching together fine dresses for the ladies on Michigan Avenue who'd never seen the inside of such a place, who'd faint dead away if they knew the conditions under which their beautiful gowns was made. 14 hours a day, sometimes 16 during busy season. 6 days a week with Sunday off if you was lucky. But many worked 7 because the wages was so pitiful you needed every penny just to keep a roof overhead and food in your belly. The air in them sweatshops was thick with lint that got into your lungs and stayed there, causing women to cough blood into handkerchiefs they tried to hide from the foreman. The light was dim, straining eyes until headaches became constant companions. And the machines, Lord have mercy, the machines was always hungry. Now listen here, child, for this is where Lucy's body started truly becoming that map of horrors. The first mark came on a winter day in 1874, when she'd been working 16 hours straight, her eyes so tired they could barely focus, her hands moving on memory alone. The sewing machine, that iron-toothed devil, caught her left hand as she was feeding fabric through. The needle punched down faster than thought, faster than prayer, piercing straight through the tip of her index finger. Sweet Jesus, the pain shot through her like lightning, but she couldn't even scream. You scream, you lose your job, and losing your job meant starvation. She bit down on her own lip until it bled, pulled her hand free, wrapped the mangled finger in a scrap of cloth, and kept working. The foreman, cruel overseer in a different uniform, glanced over, saw the blood, and just grunted. "Clean that up. Don't get it on the fabric. Mrs. Vanderbilt don't want blood on her wedding dress." The finger never healed right. The tip was crushed. The nail grew back twisted and deformed. And on cold Chicago days, it ached something terrible. A constant reminder of the price of industrial progress. But it wasn't the last. Over the months and years that followed, Lucy lost bits and pieces of herself to the machines. Another fingertip sheared off by the cutting blade. Joints crushed when a heavy bolt of fabric fell on her hand. Knuckles swollen from repetitive motion, arthritic before she was 30. And the chemicals, great God in heaven, the chemicals they used to dye and treat the fabrics was poison. Strong acids to set colors, caustic solutions to clean and bleach, substances that burned skin on contact. Lucy's hands, once smooth despite the hardships of her youth, became a landscape of chemical burns. Skin peeled away in strips, leaving raw, weeping wounds that got infected because you couldn't stop working long enough to heal. Blisters formed and burst and formed again, creating thick calluses and puckered white scars that ran up her forearms like rivers of pain. But here's the thing about suffering that the comfortable folk never understand. It can break you, or it can forge you into something harder than steel. Lucy chose the latter. While her hands bled into the fabric of rich women's gowns, her mind sharpened on the whetstone of injustice. She started asking questions, dangerous questions. Why should we work ourselves to death so others can live in luxury? Why should children lose fingers to machines? Why should women cough blood from lint-filled lungs while the factory owners count their profits in mansions? In the evenings, when she finally stumbled home to the tenement room she shared with Albert, they would talk late into the night. Albert had found work at a radical newspaper, and he brought home ideas, books, pamphlets from the socialist and anarchist movements that was growing among Chicago's working class. They read Marx and Bakunin, Proudhon and Kropotkin. They attended meetings of the Working Men's Party, where immigrants and native-born Americans, black folks and white folks, all came together around one simple truth. The bosses was robbing them blind, and the only way to stop it was to organize. Lucy discovered she had a gift, a voice that could cut through noise and reach people's hearts. When she spoke at those meetings, telling of her own experiences, showing her scarred hands, describing the daily horrors of the sweatshops, people listened. Women wept. Men clenched their fists in rage. And they organized. But the bosses didn't sit idle. They had their own weapons. The police, the courts, the laws written to protect property over people. When workers tried to form unions, company thugs beat them in the streets. When they went on strike, the police arrested them for disturbing the peace. When they demanded 8 hours instead of 14, the newspapers, owned by the same rich men who owned the factories, called them anarchists, communists, troublemakers, threats to civilization. Lucy learned that the fight wouldn't be won with polite requests or patient waiting. The masters, whether plantation owners or factory bosses, never gave up power voluntarily. You had to take it, had to fight for every inch of dignity and justice. And that fight left its own marks on the body. Bruises from police batons when protests was broken up, scrapes from being dragged off to jail, the bone-deep exhaustion of trying to work full-time while also organizing for revolution. By 1876, Lucy and Albert was fully committed to the radical labor movement. They joined the Social Democratic Party, then the anarchist faction when the socialists proved too timid. Lucy became a regular speaker at rallies, her voice growing stronger and more fearless with each appearance. She spoke of her time in bondage, of the chains that had been replaced but never truly broken, of the wage slavery that was killing workers just as surely as the overseer's whip had killed her ancestors. And she spoke of resistance, of sabotage, slowing down production, breaking machines accidentally, making the bosses pay for their cruelty, of strikes and boycotts, of the general strike that would bring the whole rotten system to its knees, of revolution, not someday in the distant future, but now, in their lifetimes, in their city. The factory owners and their paid politicians listened with growing alarm. This black woman with the scarred hands and the burning eyes, this former slave who refused to bow, this agitator who was turning workers against their betters, she was dangerous. More dangerous than they'd realized, and dangerous things had to be dealt with. The Pinkertons started following her, noting who she met with, what she said. The police added her name to their lists of known radicals. The newspapers published cartoons depicting her as a wild-eyed fanatic, a threat to decent society. But Lucy just laughed that bitter laugh of someone who'd survived worse and kept her speaking, kept organizing, kept building toward something bigger. And all the while, the machines kept eating fingers like they was bread. The chemicals kept burning skin. The hours kept grinding away at life and health and hope. But Lucy Parsons, that woman of steel, that fierce warrior, she turned every scar into a sermon, every wound into a weapon, every drop of blood into fuel for the fire that was coming. For she knew what the comfortable folk didn't, that suffering can birth revolution. And revolution was stirring in the heart of Chicago like a storm about to break. Now you see, people, while the bosses counted dollars, the workers was counting their dead. And in 1877, that river of blood and rage was about to overflow its banks. Don't be fooled, children. The year 1877 didn't start with revolution. It started with the same old suffering, the same grinding poverty, the same workers breaking their backs while the rich got richer. But underneath the surface, something was building. A rage so deep and so widespread that when it finally exploded, it shook the whole country like an earthquake. The spark came from the railroads, them steel ribbons that connected the nation, that carried goods and people from coast to coast, was built on the broken bodies of Irish and Chinese workers, and run by bosses who squeezed profit from every mile of track. In July of 1877, the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad announced another wage cut, the fourth in 3 years, and the workers finally said, "Enough." They went on strike in Maryland, then West Virginia, and the strike spread like wildfire across the nation. Pittsburgh, St. Louis, Cincinnati, and Chicago, Lord have mercy. Chicago became one of the epicenters of what folks started calling the Great Railroad Strike, though it was more than that. It was a general uprising of the working class, a rebellion against the whole system that treated human beings like disposable machinery. Lucy and Albert was right there in the thick of it from the start. They'd been preparing for this moment, organizing in secret, building networks among the different trades and ethnic groups. When the call went out for a general strike in Chicago, all workers, all industries united in common cause, Lucy climbed onto a wagon in the middle of a crowd of thousands and spoke with a voice that carried over the noise like a prophet crying in the wilderness. "Brothers and sisters," she called out, her scarred hands raised high. "How long we gonna let them grind us into dust? How long we gonna watch our children starve while they feast? They cut our wages and raise our rents. They work us till we drop dead and then replace us like we was cogs in a machine. Well, I say no more. I say we stop their machines. I say we shut down this whole city until they give us what we deserve. Dignity, justice, and bread for our babies." The crowd roared its approval. Men who'd been beaten down by years of servitude to the bosses suddenly stood straighter, felt the power of collective action coursing through their veins. Women who'd wept in silence over dead children and crushed husbands found their voices and joined the chorus. And the strike began to spread through Chicago like a holy fire, shutting down factories and rail yards and stockyards, bringing the city's commerce to a standstill. But the bosses struck back hard, harder than most workers expected. They called in the police, who came with clubs swinging, cracking skulls and breaking bones. They called in federal troops, sent by President Hayes himself at the request of the railroad companies. They brought in Pinkerton agents, hired guns who didn't hesitate to shoot into crowds of strikers. Lucy witnessed horrors that rivaled anything she'd seen in the South. On the evening of July 25th, she was in a crowd of workers at the Halsted Street Viaduct when the police charged. Batons rose and fell like the overseer's whip, and bodies dropped to the cobblestones in pools of blood. She saw a man, Irish fellow named Murphy who worked at McCormick Reaper, get his head split open, saw the gray matter spilling out as he fell. Saw a woman, Polish, pregnant, maybe 6 months along, get trampled by police horses, her screams cutting through the chaos. Lucy herself barely escaped. A police club grazed her shoulder, leaving a bruise that turned black and purple and ached for weeks. She ran through alleyways with Albert, both of them ducking into a basement as mounted police thundered past overhead. That night, hidden in the dark while the city burned and gunfire echoed through the streets, Lucy felt something harden in her heart. This wasn't politics anymore. This was war. Over the next days, the strike escalated into open combat. Workers built barricades in the streets, fought pitched battles with police and federal troops. The railroads brought in strikebreakers, desperate men willing to cross picket lines for a pittance, and the strikers attacked them, overturning rail cars, tearing up tracks, burning switching stations. The city's commercial district came to a complete halt. Nothing moved, nothing shipped. The bosses was losing money by the hour, and they responded with savage violence. Lucy kept organizing even as the repression intensified. She moved from meeting to meeting, always one step ahead of the police who'd been ordered to arrest the strike leaders. She spoke in tenements and taverns, in basement rooms and back alleys, urging workers not to give up, to hold firm, to remember that their strength lay in unity. Her voice grew hoarse from constant speaking, but she wouldn't stop. And she saw her body marked again by this struggle. Not just the shoulder bruise, but new scars. A cut on her forehead from a thrown bottle during a riot. A burn on her arm from when she helped set fire to a railroad tie as a barricade. She went days without sleep, Living on coffee and adrenaline, her nerves stretched tight as wire. The constant fear of arrest, of being beaten or killed, took its own toll, a spiritual scarring that ran deeper than flesh. Albert was right beside her through it all, just as committed, just as fearless. They made a formidable team. Him with his newspaper connections and ability to write stirring manifestos, her with her oratory gifts, and her ability to connect with workers of all backgrounds. Together they helped coordinate strike actions across different industries, trying to build the general strike that would bring the whole system down. But in the end, the combined power of the state, the corporations, and their hired guns was too much. After 2 weeks of bloody conflict, after dozens killed and hundreds arrested, after the National Guard occupied the city like a conquered territory, the strike began to crumble. Workers went back to work, defeated, but not broken. The wage cuts remained. The bosses won. Yet something had changed. The workers of Chicago and of the whole country had glimpsed their own power. They'd seen what could happen when they united across ethnic and racial lines, when they refused to accept their oppression passively. They'd learned that the comfortable classes would use any level of violence to maintain their privilege, but also that workers could fight back, could make the bosses bleed financially, if not physically. Lucy took the lessons of 1877 and carved them into her bones alongside all her other scars. She learned that reform was a fantasy, that the system wouldn't be fixed by voting or petitions or appeals to the better nature of the ruling class, because they had no better nature, only naked self-interest. She learned that only direct action, only revolution, only the complete overthrow of capitalism would bring real freedom. In the aftermath, as the city returned to its normal rhythms of exploitation and suffering, Lucy and Albert threw themselves deeper into the anarchist movement. They joined the International Working People's Association, the IWPA, a coalition of radical workers who believed in propaganda by deed, in strikes and sabotage, in building a new world from the ashes of the old. Lucy's reputation grew. Workers knew her as someone who'd been there in the streets, who'd risked her life alongside them, who bore the marks of struggle on her own body. When she spoke at rallies, her scarred hands became symbols, proof that she wasn't some armchair radical but a true comrade who shared their suffering and their fight. And so they built toward the next confrontation, the next battle in the endless war between labor and capital. They vowed that next time, they'd be better prepared, better organized, more willing to use whatever force was necessary to win. They didn't know yet that the next great uprising was less than a decade away, that it would center on a simple demand: 8 hours for work, 8 for rest, 8 for what we will, and that it would end with Albert swinging from a rope while Lucy screamed his name. But they could feel it coming, could sense that history was moving toward some terrible reckoning. To this day, folks swear. The streets of Chicago still carry the bloodstains of 1877, still echo with the sound of workers marching and police clubs falling, and Lucy Parsons' voice crying out for justice in a world built on cruelty. Gather round, children of struggle. For now I tell you of a promise that became a curse, of a hope that turned to horror, of a spring evening in 1886 when the world changed forever, and Lucy Parsons' life was split clean in two, before Haymarket and after. The demand was simple: 8 hours for work, 8 hours for rest, 8 hours for what we will. 8 hours instead of the crushing 12 or 14 or 16 that was killing workers by the thousands, wearing them down until they dropped dead in their 30s and 40s, used up and discarded like worn-out tools. It was a rallying cry that united workers across the nation, a goal so reasonable that even the bosses couldn't argue against it without revealing their true nature as vampires feeding on human misery. By 1886, the 8-hour movement had become a tidal wave. May the 1st was set as the day when workers across America would strike until the demand was met. In Chicago, the center of radical labor organizing, the anticipation was electric. Lucy and Albert threw themselves into the campaign with all their considerable energy, speaking at rallies that drew thousands, writing manifestos that circulated among the working class, organizing strikes and demonstrations. Lucy's voice rang out across packed meeting halls and crowded street corners. They tell us 8 hours is unreasonable. They tell us it will ruin business. But I ask you, is it unreasonable to want time to sleep, to eat, to see your children before they're grown and gone? Is it unreasonable to want a life that's more than just work and death? The bosses take 16 hours of our day and give us poverty in return. We demand 8 hours in justice, and we won't be satisfied with less. The workers responded with fire in their bellies. On May 1st, strikes rolled across Chicago like thunder. 80,000 workers walked off their jobs in a massive show of solidarity. The city's industries ground to a halt. For a few glorious days, it seemed like the impossible might become real. But the bosses had other plans. On May 3rd, at the McCormick Reaper Works, striking workers gathered outside the factory as scabs, strikebreakers, was brought in to replace them. Tempers flared, rocks was thrown, and then the police opened fire. 6 workers fell dead on the spot, shot down in cold blood for the crime of demanding fair treatment. Dozens more was wounded, bleeding on the cobblestones while the police stood over them with smoking guns. Sweet Jesus. The news spread through the workers' community like a plague. Albert and Lucy, along with other anarchist leaders, immediately called for a protest rally the next day, May 4th, in Haymarket Square. Attention working men, their circular read. Great meeting tonight to denounce the latest atrocious act of the police in shooting our fellow workmen yesterday. The evening of May 4th was cool and threatening rain. Lucy and Albert arrived at Haymarket Square with their children. By now they had 2 little ones who'd been brought to more labor rallies than most adults attend in a lifetime. The square wasn't particularly large, just an open space at the intersection of Randolph and Des Plaines streets, surrounded by warehouses and factories. A wagon was pulled up to serve as a speaker's platform. The crowd that gathered was smaller than expected, maybe 2,000 people instead of the hoped-for 10,000. Many had stayed home because of the threatening weather or because they feared police violence. The mayor himself, Carter Harrison, was there watching, and he later testified that the meeting was peaceful, orderly, nothing threatening about it. Albert spoke first, his voice strong and clear in the gathering dusk. The working people of this city have submitted to outrages at the hands of the police, and I, for one, am willing to die to resist them. The crowd roared approval. Then other speakers took their turns, denouncing police brutality, calling for workers to arm themselves in self-defense, dreaming aloud of a world without bosses and wage slavery. As the speeches continued and rain began to fall, Lucy decided to take the children home. They was tired and cold, and the meeting seemed to be winding down without incident. Albert kissed her goodbye and stayed to hear the final speaker. She gathered the little ones and left, walking through darkening streets toward their tenement, tired but hopeful that maybe, just maybe, this movement would finally bring the changes they'd been fighting for. That's when hell opened up. She'd barely reached home when she heard it, a massive explosion echoing across the city, followed by gunfire. Lots of it, a sustained barrage that spoke of chaos and death. Her blood turned to ice. She knew in her bones, that something terrible had happened at Haymarket. The truth came out slowly over the next hours and days, pieced together from survivors and witnesses and the police's own contradictory accounts. After Albert had left the platform and the crowd had begun to disperse, someone, never identified, never known, had thrown a bomb into the ranks of police who'd been ordered to break up the meeting. The explosion killed Officer Matthias Deegan instantly and wounded dozens more. The police, panicked and enraged, opened fire wildly into the crowd and into each other. When the smoke cleared, 7 more policemen was dead or dying, most killed by their own comrades' bullets, and 4 workers lay dead with dozens wounded. The city went mad with fear and rage. The newspapers screamed for blood, calling the anarchists terrorists and murderers, demanding swift vengeance. Never mind that nobody knew who threw the bomb. Never mind that the speakers had already left or was leaving when it happened. Never mind that the meeting had been peaceful until the police tried to break it up illegally. The raids began that very night. Police kicked down doors across the working-class neighborhoods, arresting anarchists and socialists and anyone who'd ever attended a radical meeting. They rounded up 8 men, Albert among them, and charged them all with conspiracy to commit murder. The fact that most of them hadn't even been at Haymarket when the bomb exploded didn't matter. The fact that there was no evidence linking any of them to the bomb didn't matter. What mattered was that the ruling class wanted examples made, wanted the workers terrified back into submission. Lucy's world shattered. Her husband was in jail, held without bail, facing a death sentence. Her comrades were scattered, arrested, or in hiding. The movement they'd built was being crushed under the boot heel of state repression. And she knew, Lord of Glory, she knew what was coming. She'd seen it before in the South, seen how the powerful dealt with those who challenged their authority. The trial would be a farce, the verdict predetermined, the sentence, death. That night, in a tenement room that felt suddenly hollow and cold, Lucy Parsons touched her scarred hands to her face and wept. Not tears of despair, but of rage, of a fury so deep and so fierce that it would fuel her for the rest of her long life. They'd taken her husband, they'd murdered her comrades, they'd crushed her movement, but they hadn't broken her spirit, and they never would, for she understood now that the neck of Albert Parsons was already feeling the phantom rope, that his death was as certain as sunrise, and that her own life would become a testament to his memory and to the revolution that would one day come. Now you see, people, the jaws of the state was closing tight, and the map of horrors on Lucy's body was about to get its deepest, most permanent mark. The mark of a love destroyed by power, the scar of a widow made before her time. Listen here, folk. There are wounds that bleed and wounds that scar. And then there are wounds that never heal at all, that stay raw and weeping for the rest of your natural life. What happened to Lucy Parsons between May 1886 and November 1887 was that third kind of wound, a spiritual flaying that left her soul permanently marked. The trial was a mockery from the start, a lynching in legal robes. Judge Joseph Gary presided over the proceedings with barely concealed contempt for the defendants, ruling against every defense motion, allowing the prosecution to present wild theories and hearsay as evidence while blocking any testimony that might actually establish innocence. The jury was packed with men who'd already declared the anarchists guilty in their minds. Businessmen, clerks, salesmen, all with a vested interest in crushing the labor movement. Lucy attended every day of that damned trial, sitting in the gallery with her children, watching as the state built its case on lies and manufactured evidence. The prosecution couldn't prove who threw the bomb, couldn't even prove the defendants knew anything about it, so instead they put the defendants' words and beliefs on trial. They read from anarchist newspapers and speeches, twisted philosophy into conspiracy, turned calls for workers' rights into evidence of murderous intent. The prosecutor thundered, "These men preached violence, they called for revolution. They are responsible for every act committed in the name of anarchy." Never mind that speech wasn't crime. Never mind that the bomb thrower was never identified. Never mind that Albert hadn't even been at Haymarket when the bomb exploded. He'd already left with Lucy and the children. But Lucy understood what was really happening. This wasn't about justice. This was about terror, about sending a message to every worker who dared dream of dignity. Organize and you'll hang. Strike and you'll die. Challenge our power, and we'll destroy you and everyone you love. She watched her husband, that stubborn man who'd turned his back on white supremacy to fight for the oppressed, sit in the defendant's dock with quiet dignity, knowing he was doomed. They'd lock eyes across the courtroom, and in those glances passed a lifetime of love and shared struggle, of dreams that would never be realized, of children who'd grow up fatherless. The verdict came in August. Guilty on all counts, all 8 defendants. The sentence, death by hanging for 7 of them, 15 years in prison for the 8th. The courtroom erupted in cheers from the spectators, businessmen and their wives celebrating legal murder like it was a sporting event. Lord have mercy! Lucy felt something break inside her chest, a physical sensation like bones cracking, like her heart literally shattering into pieces. But she didn't break down. Not there, not where they could see. She stood tall, a woman of steel even in her darkest hour, and she began to fight. She traveled the country on speaking tours, addressing crowds in New York, Boston, Philadelphia, anywhere people would listen. She told the truth about the trial, about the injustice, about the men facing death for crimes they didn't commit. Her voice rang out in packed halls and church basements. "If they hang my husband, they will hang a martyr, and from his grave will rise 1,000 more who will take up the cause of justice. You can kill the body, but you cannot kill the idea. The workers will rise, will organize, will fight, and one day, we will build a world without bosses and wage slaves and courtrooms that serve only the rich." She wrote letters to governors, to politicians, to anyone with power to grant clemency. She organized petition drives that gathered hundreds of thousands of signatures. She begged, pleaded, demanded, threatened, used every tool available to save the men on death row. And through it all, her body bore new marks. Exhaustion so deep it was like carrying stones on her back. Weight loss until her clothes hung loose. Hands that trembled from stress and sleepless nights. The appeals dragged on for over a year, hope rising and falling like a tide. In October 1887, the Illinois Supreme Court upheld the convictions. Governor Oglesby commuted 2 sentences to life in prison, but refused clemency for the others. The execution was set for November 11th, 1887. Lucy fought until the very end. The night before the hanging, she tried to see Albert one last time, to hold him, to say goodbye properly. But the guards, cruel earth, they wouldn't allow it. They stripped her, humiliated her, searched every inch of her body, supposedly looking for weapons or poison she might smuggle to the prisoners. They touched her in ways that violated every shred of dignity, made her stand naked while they laughed and made crude comments, treated her like property just as the slavers had treated her ancestors. That violation, sweet Jesus, that shame burned deeper than any chemical, cut deeper than any machine. It was the mark of absolute powerlessness, the reminder that the state could do anything to you and you had no recourse, no protection, no rights they had to respect. Her neck seemed to feel the rope even though it wasn't her being hanged. A phantom sensation that would haunt her for decades, a burning around her throat whenever she thought of that night. They let her see Albert briefly through bars, separated by guards, unable to touch. His last words to her was defiant. "Will you let them see you grieve? Will you give them that satisfaction?" And she shook her head, swallowing her tears, promising to carry on the fight, to make his death mean something. November 11th, 1887. 4 men, Albert Parsons, August Spies, Adolf Fischer, and George Engel, was led to the gallows in Cook County Jail. A 5th, Louis Ling, had blown himself up in his cell the day before, rather than give them the satisfaction of hanging him. As the nooses was placed around their necks, the men sang the Marseillaise and shouted final defiant words. Spies cried out, "The time will come when our silence will be more powerful than the voices you strangle today." Then the traps dropped, the bodies jerked and swayed, and Lucy Parsons became a widow, her beloved strangled to death by the state while she stood outside the jail walls with thousands of workers who'd come to bear witness, all of them powerless to stop the murder happening inside. That night, something crystallized in Lucy's soul. They'd taken her husband, but they'd created something far more dangerous. A woman with nothing left to lose, a widow consumed by righteous fury, a voice that would spend the next half-century crying out for revolution. The rope that killed Albert Parsons burned Lucy's neck just as surely as if she'd been hanged alongside him, an invisible scar that marked her as the Haymarket widow, the woman who would never forgive, never forget, never stop fighting until her dying breath. And that's how it all started. The legend of Lucy Parsons, the revolutionary who was born in slavery and reborn in the fire of her husband's martyrdom. Don't tell me that, someone might say when they hear how Lucy Parsons refused to crumble after they hanged her husband. But I'm telling you true, children. She became fiercer, more dangerous, more uncompromising than ever before. The bosses and their police thought they'd silenced the movement by killing its leaders. Instead, They'd created a martyr's widow who turned her grief into a weapon sharp enough to cut through lies and strike at the heart of power. In them, days after the hanging, Lucy could have retreated into mourning, could have raised her children quietly and tried to build a simple life. Many widows did just that, worn down by tragedy and terror. But Lucy Parsons wasn't built for quiet submission. She was forged in the fires of slavery and wage bondage, tempered by loss and suffering. And she came out of the crucible harder than steel. She took on a new title, the Haymarket Widow, and she wore it like armor, like a badge of honor, like proof that she'd survived what the state had thrown at her and was still standing, still fighting, still dangerous. Within weeks of Albert's execution, she was back on the speaking circuit, traveling across the country to tell the story of the Haymarket martyrs, to keep their memory alive, to recruit new soldiers for the revolution. Her speeches became legendary. She'd stand on a platform, sometimes an actual stage, sometimes just a wooden crate in a factory yard, and she'd show her hands. Them scarred, mutilated hands with the missing fingertips and the chemical burns. Hands that told the story of industrial capitalism's cruelty without a single word needing to be spoken. Then she'd speak, and her voice would carry across the crowd like thunder. Look at these hands. The machines ate my fingers while I made fine dresses for ladies who never worked a day in their lives. Look at these scars. The chemicals burned my skin while the bosses counted their profits. And they took my husband, murdered him legally, because he dared to say workers deserve dignity, because he dared to dream of 8 hours instead of 16, because he threatened their power by speaking truth. The crowds would roar, men would weep openly, women would clutch their children and vow never to forget. And Lucy would press on, her message growing more radical with each passing year. They tell you to be patient. They tell you reform will come if you just vote for the right politician, if you just ask nicely, if you just work hard and keep your head down. But I tell you, the masters never gave freedom to the slaves. The bosses will never give justice to the workers. What we have, we must take. What we want, we must seize. And if dynamite is what it takes to bring down their mansions and their factories and their whole rotten system, then let there be dynamite. Dangerous words, seditious words, words that got her arrested again and again. The police kept files on her, thick folders documenting every speech, every meeting, every time she appeared in public. The Pinkertons followed her everywhere, noting who she talked to, what she said, trying to build a case that would put her in prison or, better yet, from their perspective, send her to the gallows alongside her husband. But they couldn't touch her. She was too careful, too smart, too aware of the line between fiery rhetoric and actual conspiracy. She preached revolution but never personally engaged in violence. She advocated for the overthrow of capitalism, but always in theoretical, abstract terms that couldn't be prosecuted. She was a thorn in the side of every police chief and factory owner in America, but a thorn they couldn't extract without making her a martyr and inspiring 10 more just like her. In 1889, Lucy published Albert's autobiography, Life of Albert R. Parsons, with her own introduction telling the true story of Haymarket, of the trial, of the execution. The book sold thousands of copies and became a recruiting tool for the anarchist movement, keeping the memory of the martyrs alive and drawing new converts to the cause. She also became an editor and contributor to radical newspapers, The Alarm, Freedom, The Liberator. Her articles was incendiary, pulling no punches, naming names, calling for the destruction of the wage system and the capitalist state. She wrote about women's oppression, about racism, about imperialism, connecting all forms of domination to the central evil of private property and economic exploitation. And through it all, her body continued to serve as a living testament. The scars from the sweatshops remained. New ones was added. A broken rib from when police clubbed her during a demonstration in 1891. Burns on her legs from tear gas used to break up a march in 1893. The permanent damage to her voice from years of shouting over hostile crowds and through clouds of smoke at outdoor rallies. She aged rapidly during these years. The stress, the travel, the constant struggle took their toll. Her hair went gray early. Lines carved themselves deep into her face. She developed chronic pain in her joints from old injuries that never healed properly. But she wore her aging like she wore her scars, as proof of commitment, as evidence of a life fully spent in service to the cause. Lucy also faced struggles within the movement itself. Some male anarchists didn't want to take orders from a woman, especially a black woman, especially one who spoke as forcefully as Lucy did. Some socialists thought the anarchists was too extreme, too willing to embrace violence. There was endless debates about tactics, strategy, theory, debates that sometimes turned bitter and personal. But Lucy held firm to her principles. She believed in direct action, in the propaganda of the deed, in revolution, not reform. She believed the working class had to organize itself, couldn't rely on politicians or lawyers or anyone from the comfortable classes to save them. She believed women and people of color had to be at the forefront of any real revolutionary movement, because they suffered the most under the current system. In 1905, a new flame awakened, the industrial workers of the world, the IWW, the Wobblies. A union that welcomed all workers regardless of race, gender, nationality, or skill level. A union that believed in industrial solidarity and the general strike. A union that sang, "It is we who plowed the prairies, built the cities where they trade, dug the mines and built the workshops, endless miles of railroad laid. We can break their haughty power, gain our freedom when we learn that the union makes us strong." Lucy was there at the founding convention in Chicago, one of only 2 women present. She spoke alongside Big Bill Haywood and Eugene Debs and Mother Jones, demanding that the new union reject racism, reject sexism, reject craft divisions, and unite all workers in one big union capable of overthrowing capitalism and building a new world. And they listened to the Haymarket widow, respected her wisdom bought with suffering, honored her place as a living link to the martyrs whose blood had watered the tree of revolution. Now you see, people, the body marked by machines and chemicals and police batons became a pulpit, a platform, a sacred text written in flesh and pain. Lucy Parsons transformed herself from victim to warrior, from mourner to prophet, and the bosses trembled because they knew. She would never stop, never surrender, never forgive. Gather round, for now I tell you of a union unlike any other, of workers who sang while they fought, who dreamed while they starved, who believed that one day, one glorious day, the whole working class would rise up as one and take back everything the bosses had stolen. They called themselves the industrial workers of the world, but everybody knew them as the Wobblies, and Lucy Parsons threw herself into their struggle like a woman possessed. The IWW was founded in 1905 on a simple principle. All workers, regardless of skill or race or gender, belong to one class, the working class, and should organize in one big union to fight the bosses. No more divisions between craft unions that excluded the unskilled. No more racism that kept black and white workers from uniting. No more sexism that treated women as inferior. Just solidarity, pure, fierce, uncompromising solidarity. Lucy loved the Wobblies from the start because they embodied everything she'd been fighting for since Albert's death. They understood that the state was the boss's weapon, that politicians couldn't be trusted, that reform was a trap. They believed in direct action, strikes, slowdowns, sabotage, anything that hurt the boss's profits and built workers' power. And they sang, "Lord have mercy." They sang songs that made your heart soar and your fists clench. Dump the bosses off your back. Workers of the world, awaken. Break your chains, demand your rights. All the wealth you make is taken by exploiting parasites. Lucy became one of the Wobblies' most effective organizers and speakers. She traveled from city to city, from mining camps to lumber camps to textile mills, bringing the message of industrial unionism to workers who'd been told they was too ignorant, too unskilled, too foreign, too female, too black to organize. She told them they was wrong, that every worker, from the skilled machinist to the lowliest ditch digger, had power if they'd just use it collectively. In 1909, she led a march of unemployed workers through the wealthy neighborhoods of Chicago. Thousands of jobless men and women, starving and desperate, marching right up to the mansions on Michigan Avenue, where the rich ladies was hosting tea parties and charity balls. The protesters demanded bread, demanded work, demanded that the wealth stolen from workers be returned to them. The rich folks nearly fainted from shock. Police on horseback charged the marchers, clubs swinging, trying to drive them back to the slums where they belonged. But Lucy stood her ground at the front of the column, her voice rising above the chaos. These are the people who built your mansions. These are the people who made your fortunes. And now they're starving while you feast. Give them bread or face revolution. The police arrested her, not the first time, wouldn't be the last, and she spent 30 days in jail. But the action made headlines, embarrassed the wealthy, inspired workers across the country. That's what Lucy understood. Sometimes you had to make the comfortable uncomfortable, had to force them to see the suffering their comfort was built on. But organizing with the Wobblies brought new scars to her body. In 1910, during a textile strike in Chicago, she was leading a picket line when company thugs attacked with baseball bats and brass knuckles. Lucy took a blow to the head that left her dizzy and bleeding, a gash that required stitches and left a permanent scar hidden in her hairline. Her ribs was bruised so badly she could barely breathe for weeks. In 1912, she traveled to Lawrence, Massachusetts to support the famous Bread and Roses strike. 30,000 textile workers, mostly immigrant women, walking out to protest wage cuts. Lucy marched in the freezing cold alongside Polish and Italian and Syrian women, her aging body struggling with the harsh weather. She developed a persistent cough that winter, a rattling in her lungs from the cold and the mill lint and the tear gas the police used to break up demonstrations. That cough never fully went away. She also faced the constant stress of police surveillance. The authorities knew she was dangerous, not because she personally committed violence, but because her words inspired others to resist. They tapped her phone, read her mail, had agents follow her everywhere. The constant knowledge that she was being watched, that one wrong move could mean prison or deportation or worse, created a psychological burden that weighed heavier than any physical pain. And there was sexism, even within the radical movement. Some male Wobblies resented taking direction from a woman. They'd interrupt her at meetings, dismiss her ideas, patronize her with comments about how emotional or impractical she was being. Lucy fought them with the same fierce determination she fought the bosses, refusing to be silenced, demanding respect, showing through her actions that she was as committed and capable as any man. She also dealt with racism from white workers who claimed to support class solidarity, but couldn't quite get past their prejudice. Lucy was light-skinned enough to sometimes pass for white, but she never hid her mixed heritage, never pretended to be something she wasn't, and she constantly pushed the IWW to confront racism within its ranks, to actively recruit and promote black workers, to understand that racial oppression and economic exploitation was two sides of the same coin. Through it all, Lucy kept writing, kept speaking, kept organizing. She published articles about the need for workers to arm themselves, about the futility of electoral politics, about the coming revolution. She spoke at rallies from San Francisco to New York, her voice, grown raspy from years of use, still carrying power and conviction. In 1915, as World War I raged in Europe and the United States prepared to enter the conflict, Lucy denounced the war as a capitalist plot to get workers to kill each other for the profit of arms manufacturers and bankers. Why should workers fight and die for the bosses' empires? She demanded. The only war worth fighting is the class war. Workers against capitalists, and that war knows no national boundaries. Such talk was dangerous. The government was cracking down on radicals, deporting immigrants, jailing dissenters under new sedition laws. The Wobblies was being crushed by state repression, their leaders arrested, their halls raided, their newspapers shut down. Lucy watched as the movement she'd helped build was systematically destroyed by the combined power of corporations and government. But even as the IWW was broken, Lucy refused to give up. She kept the flame alive, kept the memory of the Haymarket martyrs and the Wobbly martyrs burning bright. She spoke to smaller crowds now, in dingy halls and street corners, but she spoke with the same fire, the same conviction, the same absolute certainty that one day the workers would rise and the whole rotten system would come crashing down. Her body bore the marks of decades of struggle, the old scars from the sweatshops, the newer ones from police violence, the chronic pain in joints worn down by years of hard living, the cough that never quite healed, the exhaustion that settled into her bones like winter cold. But she wore those marks with pride, like medals earned in battle, like proof that she'd lived a life that mattered. And so Lucy Parsons, that fierce warrior, that woman of steel, that voice that had refused to be silenced by widowhood or repression or age, continued her fight. She led the hungry against the wealthy, organized the desperate against the powerful, preached revolution to anyone who would listen. The map of horrors on her body grew more complex, more detailed, more comprehensive with each passing year, until she herself became a living archive of working-class struggle, a testament written in flesh and blood and unbreakable spirit. To this day, folks swear. When the Wobblies sang their songs of solidarity and sabotage, Lucy Parsons' scarred hands kept time like they was conducting a symphony of revolution, and her voice rose above them all, crying out for a world where no worker would ever again know the whip or the machine or the rope. Listen here, child. There's a special kind of cruelty that comes not in sudden violence, but in the slow grinding down of years, in watching everything you fought for crumble while you grow old and tired, and the world seems to forget why you fought at all. That was Lucy Parsons' lot from 1910 through the 1930s. Decades of iron silence when the revolution seemed further away than ever, and the price of resistance kept mounting in ways that cut deeper than any police baton. The Red Scare that followed World War I was like nothing she'd seen before. The government, terrified of the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, unleashed a wave of repression that made the Haymarket persecution look almost gentle by comparison. Attorney General Mitchell Palmer and his young assistant J. Edgar Hoover orchestrated raids across the country, arresting thousands of radicals, deporting immigrants by the shipload, destroying unions and radical newspapers and any organization that dared challenge capitalism. The Wobblies was crushed. Leaders was imprisoned or driven underground. Meeting halls was raided and burned. The great dream of one big union capable of overthrowing the bosses through a general strike. That dream was shattered against the combined power of the state, the corporations, and public hysteria whipped up by newspapers that painted every radical as a bomb-throwing terrorist. Lucy watched it all with a heart heavy as stone. She'd spent decades building this movement, organizing workers, spreading the revolutionary gospel, and now it was being systematically destroyed. The authorities couldn't arrest her. She was too well known, too careful with her words, and making her a martyr would only inspire more resistance. Instead, they isolated her, marginalized her, tried to make her irrelevant. Postal censorship banned her publications from the mail. Newspapers refused to print her articles or announcements of her speeches. Meeting halls suddenly became unavailable when she tried to rent them. Police would show up at events where she was scheduled to speak, not to arrest her, but to intimidate the audience, to make it clear that anyone who listened to Lucy Parsons was putting themselves on a government list. And the personal losses, Lord of Glory, the personal losses nearly broke her. Her daughter Lulu, born during the hopeful years with Albert, died young in 1904 from complications of an infection. Lucy had already buried her husband. Now she buried her child. The grief was a wound that never healed, a scar on her soul deeper than any physical mark. Her son George met a fate almost worse. He showed signs of mental illness as he grew older, whether from trauma, genetics, or the stress of being Lucy Parsons' son in a hostile world. Nobody knew. In the 1920s, he was committed to an institution against his will, essentially imprisoned for the crime of being inconvenient, of not fitting into normal society. Lucy fought to get him released, visited when they'd let her, but she was powerless to save her own child from the system that had already taken her husband. The years took their toll on her body as well. She was in her 70s now, then her 80s, an old woman in a world that had changed beyond recognition. The chronic cough from the Lawrence strike grew worse, settling permanently in her lungs. Her joints ached constantly from arthritis compounded by old injuries. Her hands, those scarred monuments to industrial cruelty, trembled with age and nerve damage. Her voice, once powerful enough to reach thousands, grew raspy and weak. But even diminished, even isolated, even grieving, Lucy refused to surrender. She kept speaking to whoever would listen, smaller crowds now in dingy halls and street corners, but speaking nonetheless. She marched with the unemployed during the Great Depression, her aged body struggling to keep pace with younger protesters, but her spirit unbroken. When police tried to break up demonstrations of starving workers demanding relief, 80-year-old Lucy Parsons was right there in the front line, daring them to club an old woman. She witnessed new horrors too. The rise of fascism in Europe, the Spanish Civil War where anarchists fought and died against Franco's forces, the continued lynching of black people in the South, her people, the descendants of slaves like herself, still being murdered with impunity, the persistence of poverty and exploitation despite all the struggles, all the strikes, all the martyrs. Sometimes, in the dark quiet of her small apartment, Lucy must have wondered if it had all been for nothing. If Albert's death had meant anything. If the decades of struggle had moved the world even an inch toward justice. The doubt must have crept in like cold through poorly insulated walls, doubt that she'd fight off come morning, but that haunted her nights. Yet she persisted. She wrote her memoirs, trying to preserve the truth of Haymarket for future generations. She mentored young radicals, passing on knowledge earned through bitter experience. She connected the old struggles to the new ones, showing how the fight against wage slavery was the same fight as the battle against fascism, racism, imperialism, all manifestations of the same evil system that treated human beings as disposable resources. In the late 1930s, as World War II approached, and America geared up for another conflict that would fill capitalists' pockets with workers' blood, Lucy's voice rose one more time in protest. She denounced the coming war just as she'd denounced World War I, calling it a boss's war, demanding that workers refuse to fight. The FBI, Hoover's FBI now, grown powerful and paranoid, kept thick files on her, monitored her movements, waited for her to slip up and give them an excuse to silence her permanently. But she was too smart, too experienced, too careful. She preached revolution in theoretical terms that couldn't be prosecuted. She inspired resistance without personally engaging in violence. She remained a thorn in the side of every authority, every boss, every politician who claimed to speak for the people while serving only the wealthy. The world had changed around her, but Lucy Parsons remained constant, a living link to the martyrs of Haymarket. A witness to decades of struggle, a map of horrors written in flesh that testified to the brutality of capitalism and the resilience of those who fought it. Even in silence, even isolated, even old and tired, she was dangerous because she remembered, because she refused to let the past be forgotten or the fight abandoned. Now you see, people. The years of iron tried to crush her spirit like the machines had crushed her fingers, but spirit don't break like bone. It bends, it endures. It waits for the moment to rise again. And Lucy Parsons, that stubborn old warrior, was waiting still. Don't be fooled, children. Death comes for us all eventually, but how it comes and what it means, that's where the story gets its power. Lucy Parsons lived to be near 90 years old, survived slavery and wage slavery, police batons and factory machines, the execution of her husband and the loss of her children. Decades of struggle that would have broken lesser souls. And when death finally came for her in 1942, it came in fire. Fitting, somehow, for a woman who'd spent her life preaching revolution and warning that the old world would burn before the new one could be born. She was living in a small house on North Troy Street in Chicago, surrounded by decades of accumulated papers. Her writings, Albert's letters, photographs of the Haymarket martyrs, records of strikes and protests and organizing drives going back 50 years. Her library was her treasure, her archive, the physical evidence that the struggles had been real, that the martyrs hadn't died in vain, that history was written not just by the victors, but also by those who resisted them. On March 7, 1942, Fire broke out in that house. The official story said it was an electrical fault, an accident, just one of those things that happens in old buildings with old wiring. But folks who knew Lucy, who understood how closely the FBI and police had monitored her for decades, they wondered. They whispered about how convenient it was that the fire destroyed not just Lucy, but also her entire archive, all those documents that told truths the powerful would rather forget. The fire moved fast. Lucy, nearly 90 years old, her body worn down by a lifetime of struggle, couldn't escape. Some say she tried to save her papers, tried to gather Albert's letters and the Haymarket records before fleeing. Some say she was overcome by smoke before she even knew what was happening. Either way, she died in that fire, and with her died decades of irreplaceable historical records. But here's the thing about Lucy Parsons. Here's what the powerful never understood. You can kill the body, you can burn the papers, but you can't destroy an idea whose time has come. You can't erase the mark she left on history, the inspiration she provided to generations of workers who saw in her scarred hands and unbreakable spirit a model for their own resistance. Her body itself was the ultimate testimony, a map of horrors that told the whole brutal story of capitalism in America. The missing fingertips spoke of machines that valued profit over human flesh. The chemical burns testified to bosses who cared more about production than workers' safety. The scars from police batons recalled how the state served capital, protecting property while brutalizing the poor. The invisible mark around her neck, that phantom rope she'd carried since they hanged Albert, reminded everyone that the powerful would kill to maintain their privilege. But the map pointed somewhere too. Each scar was a direction, a route to follow. The mangled fingers pointed toward smashing the machines that ate workers alive. The chemical burns pointed toward seizing the factories and running them for human need, instead of private profit. The baton marks pointed toward confronting state power with workers' power. The rope mark pointed toward the gallows where the bosses themselves would one day answer for their crimes. Lucy understood what many radicals didn't, that revolution wasn't just about overthrowing the current system, but about fundamentally transforming how human beings relate to each other, to labor, to the earth itself. She connected struggles that others saw as separate, the fight against slavery and the fight against wage slavery, the battle for women's rights and the war against capitalism, the resistance to racism and the struggle for workers' control. She saw it all as one interconnected web of oppression that required one interconnected movement to tear it down. And she showed that from the auction block to the Haymarket gallows to the picket line, the oppressed carry within them the seed of liberation. Not because they're somehow more virtuous or noble than the powerful, but because they have nothing to lose but their chains and a world to win. Because their very survival depends on solidarity and mutual aid, rather than competition and exploitation. Because they know from lived experience that the system is built on lies and can be torn down and rebuilt. In the years after her death, as World War II raged and then gave way to the Cold War, as McCarthyism tried to crush the left just as the Red Scare had before, as new movements rose, civil rights, women's liberation, anti-war, black power, Lucy's legacy lived on. Activists who'd never heard her speak nevertheless followed paths she'd helped clear. Workers who didn't know her name still sang songs the Wobblies had sung. Revolutionaries who thought they were discovering new truths was actually rediscovering wisdom Lucy had taught decades earlier. The body is map, the flesh is text, the scars is scripture. This was Lucy Parsons' final gift. She showed that our bodies remember what our minds forget, that trauma can be transformed into testimony, that suffering doesn't have to be meaningless if we use it to fuel the fight for a world where no one suffers needlessly again. So remember Lucy Parsons, children of struggle, not as victim but as warrior whose wounds mapped the road to freedom. When you hear the machines roar today, the new machines of surveillance capitalism and digital exploitation, touch your own skin and feel her there. When you face police in the streets demanding justice, remember her standing defiant despite the batons. When you organize your workplace or march for change, channel her spirit. She incited the revolution that still simmers, waiting for our hands to light the fuse. The tyrant's halls may stand, but the map on her body points the way to tear them down. The fire that took her life couldn't consume the fire she lit in the hearts of all who refused to submit to oppression. And that fire, sweet Jesus, that fire still burns, still waits, still promises that one day the workers will rise and build the world anew. The old narrator's voice drops to a whisper, heavy with the weight of memory and promise. Os que tombaram não foram esquecidos. Os que lutaram ainda caminham entre nós. E suas vozes ecoam aqui, onde guardamos o que não pode ser apagado. Lucy Parsons, ex-escrava, viúva de Haymarket, guerreira incansável, seu corpo virou mapa. Suas cicatrizes viraram roteiro, e a rota que ela traçou com sangue e luta ainda aponta o caminho. Quem sofreu, sofreu. Quem resistiu, deixou memória. E memória a gente guarda aqui, nos The Files of Slavery.